Hi everyone! Today I have a real-time tutorial for you guys. This is to celebrate me reaching 100,000 subscribers on YouTube recently. Thank you so much for all of your support here. I know I haven't been uploading as frequently, but I'm so thankful that this channel has still been able to grow this whole time, and we've reached a huge milestone that is just crazy to me. If you've stuck around from the very start, thank you so much. And if you've just found me, I hope you'll continue to stick around as I plan to make more videos more frequently. And if you enjoy this real-time tutorial, you can have a look at my Patreon page. I'll have it linked down below. But without further ado, let's get right into this tutorial for today. So I picked this photo for today's tutorial. It's from a copyright-free site, I believe from Unsplash. I'll have it linked down below if you want to take a look at the original. And let's talk about the materials I'll be using. So I will be using the HIMI gouache today, and I've already put the colors that I will mainly be using in this area. So most of the ones you see on the screen are the colors I'll be using. The other ones I most likely won't be using them. As for paper, this is just watercolor paper. It's 300 GSM. And I've just cut it down to A6 size, so it's not that big, so we can hopefully finish this painting in maybe just over an hour. And I've just taped down the edges with masking tape. You could use washi tape as well, whichever is more convenient. As for my brushes, here I've picked out 4. So this is my 1/2 inch angular shader. I use this for the background. I have 2 round brushes here. Both of them are size 6. This one has more of a pointed tip, so I use this for finer details. This one, because I've used it a lot for stippling, the tip has become very blunt, so I continue to use it for stippling. I would recommend that you can just get any kind of cheap round brush that doesn't have a pointed tip. They work really great for creating all kinds of textures. This brush did have a pointier tip to start with, but because I just kept using it for stippling, it's become more blunt. So you don't have to get this exact brush for the stippling technique. And then here I've got a size 1 liner brush. This is just in case I need to do any finer details. I'll use this brush, which will be a little bit easier to control. And I'll have all of these linked down in the description. You'll also want to have a pencil and an eraser. This is a kneadable eraser, and this is just a normal pencil you can use to do a very simple quick sketch. I also have a spray bottle here just to mist the gouache to keep it nice and fresh while I'm using it, so you can mist the paints in the box and also your palette. If you have the HIMI gouache and you found that it has dried out, I made a video recently showing how I revived the paint, so you can definitely revive them if they've dried out. You just need some water and you just need to mix them and just let them soak a little bit. Then here I've also got a container which just has water in it. I used to use 2 jars of water, but I've gotten quite lazy recently and I just use 1. So it's up to you. You can just use 1 if you want and just change out the water halfway between, or you can have 2 jars of water and keep 1 clean. You'll also want to have some paper towels or just a towel to wipe your brushes off on. I'm just going to keep the water and the towel off camera just to save space so you can see more of the palette and the HIMI gouache. And if you don't have the HIMI gouache, you can use any other kind of gouache brand. It doesn't really matter. I will have the colors used listed down below so you can use something similar. So now let's get into the painting. We are going to start with a sketch, and I picked this photo to paint because it is fairly simple, especially in terms of the sketch. We can keep it nice and easy. So I first just want to place in the horizon line, so I'm going to keep that just a little bit below halfway, so just maybe around about here. You want to leave enough space for the tree line and the mountains, so you can just place in a straight line like that. And then I will just sketch in the mountains. So we've got one on the left side which comes up and down, and one on the right here. So there's one that's a little bit in front, so it just kind of falls down like that. And then another one behind it. When you're doing the sketch, make sure your pencil marks are very light so that you can erase them easily if you need to make any changes, and also just so they don't peek through the paint too much. And if you want to change anything, just use your eraser. I like the kneadable eraser because it doesn't leave any of the shavings from the rubber. And you can also mold it into any shape you want, so you can easily erase in the corners of things. So for example here, I can just pinch my eraser to make it very thin, and I can wipe out that line. And then you'll want to place in the tree line very loosely, so just the height of it, I think. So around about here, and it curves up here, it's a bit taller there. And also on this side, it's a bit taller. It comes down in the center. And then you're just going to want to place in the trees and foliage here, so it's a little bit slanted, comes down to about here, goes flat across, it's more angled over here, and we've just got some more foliage over here which doesn't quite reach halfway, so maybe a bit more than 1/3. So these are all quite flexible, you can change them as you're painting. I just like to sketch them in for now just to get a feel for the placement of everything. And if you want to, you can also loosely sketch in the position of some of the trees, but you don't have to, as these are going to get covered up by the paint very quickly. So now that I've got the sketch in, I'm just going to use my eraser and lighten the lines a little. This is another reason why I like the kneadable eraser. You can soften out those pencil marks by just tapping it on like this and just lifting it off, so I can still see the lines quite visibly and it doesn't completely erase it. And to clean this eraser, all you have to do is just remold it, and you'll have a new clean edge to start with. So I highly recommend this one. This is the Faber-Castell kneadable eraser, in case you're wondering. So I can get started with the painting portion now, and I'm going to start painting the sky in first, then the mountains, then the tree line, then everything in the foreground. So I tend to work from the background to the foreground. So I'm going to start with this 1/2 inch angular shader. You can use any kind of flat brush you have, doesn't have to be this specific one. And what I'm going to do is first just soak my brush through in the water, just so the bristles are wet, and we're going to paint in the gradation in the sky, which I'm going to start with a very, very pale blue into a white and then into a peachy pink color. So first you're going to want to pick up a lot of white paint. So when I'm mixing a very pale color, I like to start with white and then mix in the other color. So in this case, we'll be using this cool blue here, and you just want a little bit of it. And it's easier to start with the white because you can control it much better. If you start with too much blue, you'll end up using a lot of white to try and compensate for it and lighten it. And now to get the mixture to be creamy, you're just going to want to add a bit of water while keeping up the ratio of paint that you're using. So once I'm quite happy with it and it feels quite creamy, I'm just going to apply it onto the paper. So it feels good. I'm going to keep going. Make sure it's very creamy. You don't want the paint to be very thin and watery. And then I'm going to just keep mixing in white reach about here, I'm going to clean off all of the paint on my brush. Just rinse it all off. Then pick up some fresh white paint and make sure that's also really creamy on the brush, and just sweep just underneath a little bit and just smooth out a blend there. And that's why it's really important to have really creamy paint so that you can get these really soft and smooth transitions. I just went back into the blue a little bit just to bring it down, and then I'm going to clean that off again. And now you're going to want to mix up the peachy pink color. So again, I'll start with white just because the color is so pale. And then pick up a little bit of this cool pink, so just a tiny bit so you don't overdo it. And then a little bit of the warm yellow. And again, just a tiny bit. If I pick up too much on my brush, I just take it off on the side. And then if I need more, I'll just pick up some more off the palette. And I think I want a little bit more warm yellow in there. So you can just play around with the ratio until you're happy with that. A bit more white. And if it's feeling a bit too thick, you can add a bit of water, but then also increase the ratio of paint by mixing in a bit more. And then just test it out. So I think that looks quite good. Maybe a touch more pink. And just going to want to paint that in there. You can go over the mountains a little bit. And then once you're happy with that, just clean it off. And pick up the fresh white paint. Sweep that just above. And just soften that out and start to bring it into the blue. And then you're going to want to clean off the brush again just so you don't have too much paint in there, and just keep going back and forth with mixing the transition. I've got some more clean white. We're going to use white as the color to transition the blend. I think I want a little bit more warm yellow and a little bit more pink in the mixture, and just make the bottom a little bit stronger. And if it's too pink, just clean off the brush, pick up some white, and just drop that in and smooth it out as you go. So when you're happy with that transition, you can just give it a minute or two to dry. Make sure you've covered the sky all the way up to the mountain. You don't want any gaps in there. And then we'll just wait for it to dry, and then we'll layer on the mountains on top. And if there's any part you're not happy with, you can just clean your brush off. Make sure it's clean with a little bit of moisture and just soften out any areas. But you want to make sure the paint on the paper is very creamy before you do that. Otherwise you'll start picking up too much paint off and it will start to look too thin on the paper. So while we're waiting for it to dry, we can start mixing up the color for the mountains. And here I'm switching to my round brush, and I'm just going to soak it in some of the water. So we'll pick up some of the cool blue. We can go into this mixture here from before with the white, and I'm going to pick up quite a bit more while picking up some white, and just going to add a bit of water to it just to make it creamy. And I want to add a touch of ultramarine blue into it. add a little bit of burnt umber, which will just tone the blue down a little so it's not as vibrant, as things tend to become a little bit more dull in the distance, and these mountains are very far in the distance, so don't want them to be too saturated. So to desaturate them, I'm just adding some burnt umber, and I'll just test it out. So I think that looks quite good, and you'll notice that the mountains, they're a little bit darker up the top and a little bit paler down the bottom. So we'll make sure to get that gradation in as we're painting them. So you can go ahead and just shape out the mountains now, and you may still be able to faintly see your pencil marks behind the sky you just painted in. But if you can't, that's okay. You can just have a go at doing these freehand. You can't go too wrong with them anyways. Make sure the sky layer is dry before you do this. And as you're going down, just going to want to mix some more white into the mixture. Make sure the paint's still nice and creamy, so I'm adding in some more water as I add in more paint, and it's just going to be a little bit paler down here. And I'm just going to want to bring it right down into the tree line. I'm going to add in some more white. Just remember that dark colors in gouache dry a little bit paler, so it might look too dark now, but it will dry a bit paler than what it is now. So I've mixed in some more white, and I'm just going to sweep that in here. And you're going to want to cover all of here, even though the trees will be here. You want a color to be peeking through. And then we just want to smooth out the gradation a little, so we can clean off this brush. And I've lightly dried it off, and now I'm just going to go in. Maybe I'll pick up a bit more color, just so I'm not picking up too much of the paper, and just try and smooth that out. So the paint on the paper is very creamy, lots of paint, so I can easily smooth it out like this. I'm going to mix up a little bit of a darker mixture with some burnt umber in there. And just fix up the top. And then you're going to want to repeat the same thing on the other side. So starting with the blue that's a little bit darker up the top. If you run out of paint, just mix up some more. And I just want it to be a bit more grey, so I'm adding in a tiny touch of burnt umber, a little bit more white, and just a little bit of water. And I can still see some of my pencil marks peeking through, so I'm just going to follow that to paint in the mountain. And then mix in a little bit more white as I'm moving down. And just a little bit more water in the mixture as it's not moving on the paper smoothly, and a bit more white towards the bottom here. And we'll just give that another minute to dry. I want to layer on a mountain on top. In front of that, just make sure this is quite smoothly blended. So we'll give that a minute to dry. And because I'm using a ring light here to film, you can actually see very obviously in the paint where it's dried and where it's not. So in the wet areas, it's picking up a lot more of the glare from the light shining down. Whereas in this side, you can see it's still quite wet up here, but down the bottom where it looks a lot more matte, that's where it has dried. So you can also see in my painting which areas are wet and dry. Alright, so now that this layer has dried, I'm just going to go in and paint in the mountains on top. I do also notice that they've dried a little bit funny. There's some markings from the paint. So if you want, you can go over that with a second layer just to cover that up, or if you don't mind that, you can leave it as it is and keep going. So I'm just going to mix up some more of the blue paint with white and a touch of burnt umber just to tone it down a little. And I'll paint on the mountain on the right here, that's a little bit in front. I'll make it a bit darker with a bit more blue in there, and it's just going to come down like that. Maybe a bit more burnt umber. It's a little bit too saturated. And just keep adding white as I move down until it just blends in with the other one. Add some more white. And just smooth that out with a clean brush. And then you're going to want to paint in a base layer behind the tree line. So mix up a blue that's a bit darker, so just a little bit more of this cool blue in the mixture, and a touch of yellow in there to push it a bit towards green, and a little bit of burnt umber, which will make the color darker as well as graying it out a little. And you just want to paint this layer in behind the tree line that we are about to paint in. And because it slopes down like this, you want to follow something similar. But you don't want to bring it higher than the top of the tallest tree. So just about like that is okay. Then we will move on to painting the trees, and we'll use the same mixture. The trees are a little bit darker on either side and just a little bit lighter in value here. So we can start with a bit of a lighter value for the trees in the back and then just gradually darken them. So I'm going to start off using my round brush to see if the tip on it is enough, but if not, you can switch to a liner brush for those really fine details. So let's mix up some more of this paint first. Just grab a bit more cool blue, a touch of this cool yellow, and some burnt umber and white. Make sure this value is much darker than the value of the mountains. Touch of yellow in there. And you do want to wait for the layer we just laid down to dry, so we'll just give that a minute or two to dry. Now I can see in here the blending isn't perfect, but you can fix it up or you can leave it as it is. I'm not sure if it is the HIMI gouache that is causing it, because I did reactivate it recently, so I don't know if that changed something in it or I'm just not used to it, but it does seem a little bit odd that the markings from the brush are very clear. I will have to play around with it some more and see whether it's the gouache or it's the way that I laid it on that resulted in that. But for now, let's just move on. So you can start by painting in the trees. So I usually like to start by putting in the height of the tree first. So this brush used to come to a really pointed tip, but I think over time it's just become a little worn out, so it's a little bit harder to control. And I would advise using a round brush that has a nice tip, so this step will be much easier. What I'm going to do is just keep working with it, but if it's really difficult, I'll switch to a liner brush. So you can just paint in the tree trunks first, so just the height of them. And then for the tree itself, I just tap this on. It's a little bit hard with this brush. I'm just going to switch. Switching to a liner brush now. It's very thin, so I can get very small details. And you're just going to want to paint on the branches just on either side and try to vary the length of them and the direction in which they're pointing. I find that trees like this look most realistic when you don't paint them all the same. So make sure they're not too symmetrical in any way. I would prefer to use a round brush for this step just because it's usually a bit faster, but the liner brush does offer much more precision for finer details, so I'll have to make do with it. This step might be a little bit tedious for some people, but the results look nicer if you do put a bit more time into these details. Make sure you have enough paint on the brush so that it's not too thin and transparent. So you want to just keep going with this, and I'm going to add a little bit of white into the mixture just to paint some trees on to make it look like they're more in the distance, because the paler the color is, the more in the distance it will appear. So I've just added some white into the mixture now. And it also helps in this step if the paint mixture you're using is not too runny, because if it is, then the paint comes off the brush in blobs, which makes it harder for you to paint thinner lines. And try keep the trees thinner up the top and a little bit wider along the base. Make sure you vary the height of them. Some are taller, some are shorter. And you just want to keep going till you cover the whole thing. I'm just mixing a bit more blue into the paint, make it a little bit darker. Touch of burnt umber in there, just to grey it down a little so it's not too saturated. So just take your time with this step. Sometimes it can be quite therapeutic just to do this. It is repetitive, but it doesn't take much thinking to do, so it can be nice as well. And you also don't want this background that we painted in before to show through very obviously, so you want to just vary the height of your trees just to try and cover that line up. But you can also do that at the end. I'm just going to paint on tree trunks first. And then I'm going to mix up some darker paint with a bit more blue and burnt umber. Paint those trees on the sides, which are much darker. Just getting the height of them in first so I can map out how I want to paint them. And then I'll start going in with the details on them. So depending on the size of the tree, I also decide how detailed I want it to be. For smaller trees, I just go down them very quickly. For larger trees, I might pay a bit more attention to some of the details. If you're not sure how to paint the trees, you can just zoom right up into the reference photo and just observe how the branches are growing and just try to mimic it. And because I'll be painting some trees in front here, I don't have to go all the way down because that will get covered up. So I don't want to waste too much effort and time, so I'm just going to move on. There's the tree here, just a little bit cut off on the edge. And another tree behind. Maybe make that one a bit lighter by adding in some white into it. This part probably takes the longest out of the whole painting. After we are done with this, everything else should be a lot faster. So you can have some branches sticking down, some sticking up in all kinds of directions. Just vary them. Have some sticking out a little bit further. The worst thing to do is to paint it too symmetrically and too perfectly. That looks unrealistic. And then I just won't paint the bottom of that because Hopefully I'll have some other foliage covering it up. Maybe I'll just paint a bit of the side. Just very quickly, loosely, and then move on to the next tree. I'm going to add a little bit of white into the mixture as I start to move back into the center, just because the trees there are a little bit paler, so don't want them to be too dark. And I'm adding water to the mixture whenever it's a little bit too thick. And don't be afraid to layer on top of some trees you've already painted. This helps to make this all look more realistic and have a bit more depth. If you have every tree perfectly side by side next to each other, it's going to look more unrealistic. And I like to have some trees be much higher, just to vary things up a little. And just keep repeating this. So we've pretty much got the left side and the center almost done. We just have to paint in the trees on the right side. So here I'm stacking on top of a tree from a previous layer. You don't have to have them all perfectly spaced. And I'm going to start to darken the paint mixture as well. After this tree, I will again mix in a little bit more blue and a little bit more burnt umber. I'm going to have some trees much taller than the rest, so I'm going to paint those in first. I'll mark them in. 1, 2, 3, and I will paint them in a little bit more detailed. Okay, we've got one more big tree on the right side, and then just a few more small trees just to cover up the spacing, and we should be able to move on from this. Make sure to take some breaks in between this. It can become very repetitive and you don't want to be sitting down and cramping your hand for too long, so just take some breaks in between and come back to it if you need. And then I'm going to add a bit of white into the paint and just paint in a few more trees in between them. And also just some trees here. Maybe a little bit more white for the trees in the very center. Actually, maybe a bit darker. Just a bit of a darker paint to layer on some trees in the front. You just want to layer them on top of any previous trees you might have painted. Helps to create more depth. And I think we're just about done with this tree line. Next we'll want to move on to painting in the water, which will be a reflection of the sky. So let's clean off that brush, and we are going to go back to either the round brush or the flat brush. If you're painting on a bigger piece of paper, you can use the flat brush so you can cover more of the paper as you go, but since my painting is quite small, a round brush will be big enough. So I'm going to go back to my round brush. I'm just cleaning it off again. And you're just going to want to use the same color as the sky, since the water is just reflecting the color of that. So I'll go back into this mixture with a bit of cool red, and my HIMI gouache is looking a little bit dry, so I'm just going to mist it. Mix it with some white and a little bit more yellow. Keep it very pale, and for the water I want to keep this paint a little bit translucent, so I'll make it quite runny. And you want to start with the lighter color first, so it's a little bit too orange. I'm going to mix a bit more pink and a bit more white in there, make it a bit paler, a bit more water. So now you don't want the paint to be too thick. I'm just going to clean that off. Make it quite runny. And so the first reason you want to start with the lighter colors, because it's easier to cover a lighter color with a darker color than to go the other way around. So if we start with this, we can bring it out as far as we want, and the blue of the sky, which we'll paint it after, will still easily be able to cover it. And the reason you want the paint to be a little bit thin is because that way when the colors mix, I can just layer them on top rather than actually mixing the paint together, because this pink and blue is going to mix purple, which we don't want. So I'm going to clean that off. You can make this part closer to the tree line a little bit darker, just to reflect how the glow is coming out from behind the mountains. And then you're going to want to clean that off and pick up the light blue of the sky. And reflect that in. I'm still keeping the paint fairly thin and translucent. So you'll have bits of darker blue where it's reflecting the tree line, and I'm just going to bring it quite close but not quite into the pink yet. Add a bit more white as I approach the pink, making my paint very, very runny. Now it's very important how you treat the pink here. If you start to muddy it, it's hard to go back, so just paint around it with care for now. And while all of this paint is wet, you can just run your brush like that to create some ripples in the water. And then you'll want to go into the dark mixture. You can even put a tiny bit of black in there. Maybe a bit more burnt umber just to grey it down for the reflection. And this area here is quite dark, so you're going to want to place that in because it's reflecting a group of dark trees. And also on this side there is a reflection that's a little bit darker, so make sure you have some burnt umber in there just to tone the color down. And slightly bring it into the blue here because the paint's still wet. It's going to produce softer blends, and you'll find there should be a darker reflection underneath here as well, where the foliage is sitting on top, so you can go across that. Now, to be safe, I'm just going to clean off the brush, pick up some of this light blue and just brush that just under there, so the transition's a bit softer. And you're going to want to just treat this pink area very carefully. I'm about to start to go into it, but first I just want to mix in a bit more ripples into the blue, pick up some of the lighter paint and go into the darker paint. And I'm keeping the paint fairly thin. So usually I work very creamy, but for water I have found that keeping it thinner works better. Clean brush. So I've got a clean brush now. I'm just going to start sweeping in some colors of the blue. So I don't have any fresh paint on the brush. But now I'm going to pick up a little bit. So keep it quite runny and just start to sweep it in a little. Now just remember, the areas which you go over, you can't bring that pink back again, so just be very careful and slow with how you do this. I'm going to pick up some more water and some white. I want to keep this paint very, very light. It's very tricky. You're trying to blend it together without really blending the colors. So you don't want a harsh line where you can see where the pink starts and where the blue ends. But at the same time, you don't want to mix it so that there's a purple color. So I'm using a clean brush sometimes and just softening out things. And other times I pick up a little bit of the blue and drop it in. I'm going to bring a bit of the dark blue forward around here. Takes a little bit of playing around and very careful control of water, but something like this is what you should be aiming for. Make sure there's no gaps. And if you want, you can pick up a bit of the pink and sweep that into the blue. And then picking up some more paler blue, just paint on some ripples in the darker bits, keeping that quite thin. And then picking up some of the darker blue, paint some ripples into the lighter areas. If you want, you can use your finger to soften it out a little. So I would recommend doing that after things have dried a little bit, so that it doesn't get too messy. And anything that's too harsh, just clean your brush off and slightly soften it out. So now I want to start painting on the foliage here in the middle, and then the last thing I'll do is paint on the very foliage in the front and some of the rocks on the water. So for this part, I'm first just going to pick up a little bit of yellow ochre, place that along the top, and then I'll put in a dark base color and then paint the foliage on top of that. So if you have a pre-mixed yellow ochre, you can use that, but if not, you can mix yellow ochre from the primary colors. So you can have a go at trying to mix it if you don't have it, or you can just Google how to mix yellow ochre. I do also have some color mixing videos on my channel which might help if you are struggling with color mixing. So I'm going to pick up some more yellow ochre, maybe a tiny bit of black in there. Maybe a bit more black. So black and yellow makes green. So I'm just dulling down this yellow with some black. And I'll place that just underneath the tree line we painted. And just so the top edge isn't so flat, I'm going to just tap along it. And then you're going to want to paint it in a really dark base. So for that, I'll pick up more black. And just mix that in. And maybe a bit more yellow ochre in there. Maybe a touch of warm yellow. And I'll use this just to first block in all of this area. So this will work as the base layer for which we layer on the foliage on top. It's a little bit paler off to the left, so just mixing a little bit of white in there. So you just want to have that shaped out. And you can let that dry before you paint the foliage on top. In the meantime, if you want to, you can also just block in the front here. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more black with a touch of yellow in there, so just to push it a little bit towards green. Just block in this area. And we can let this area to dry as well. And you're going to want to paint in some distant trees here as well as closer trees along here. So we can work on those distant ones first. They're going to be lighter in value, a bit closer to the value of this, but a little bit darker, but not quite as dark as the trees we'll paint in the foreground here. So let's mix up a dark bluish green. I'm going to pick up more yellow ochre and just place it in here. Pick up a little bit of cool blue, mix that in. It's kind of a greyish mixture, a little bit more yellow ochre, maybe a little bit of cool yellow, a bit more blue, a bit more yellow ochre. And I'm actually going to switch to my stippling brush. So I want to use this brush instead, which is more blunt. I'm just going to wet it in water because I haven't used it yet, and just pick up that paint. And I'm going to stipple on the paper. So when I stipple, I like to just press on the base of the brush so the bristles come apart. And then you can just tap it on like this. And when I pick up more paint from the palette, I'm also stippling into the mixture. So it looks very flat at the moment. So we're going to start to mix in a bit more yellow into the mixture, make it a bit lighter, and just stipple on some of the lighter colors on there. So the light is coming from the right side. A little bit more yellow in there just to lighten up the mixture. And we can leave that for now. I'm going to pick up my liner brush again and just go back into this darker mixture and use it to paint in the tree trunks. So this is a mixture of black with some yellow in there. And I'll continue to paint on the tree trunks for the other trees as well. So I'll just mix up a little bit more of this dark mixture. And start to place in where the main trees are. So we've got one here. And one here. And one off to the side here. And then we'll start stippling just to cover up some of the area. So go back to your stippling brush and we'll just pick up a yellow ochre mixed in here with the black and yellow mixture. And this works well when the paint is not too wet. And you just want to stipple over the top. If you find the stippling hard to do, you can first just practice on some spare paper before doing it on the painting. And I want to make it a bit more blue, so mixing in a little bit of ultramarine blue into the mixture. Just stipple some more textures in there. Go into the darker mixture with the black, and I'll start to get the shape of the trees in there. So where I painted the tree trunks before, I'm just going to go in and stipple on the leaves on there. Once you've got the main shape of that in, we can start stippling on the highlights. So I'm going to pick up a lot more yellow into the mixture to lighten the color. A little bit of blue in there just to make it a bit more green. And I only add in a little bit of water as I try to keep the paint more on the dry side. And if you have too much paint, just take it off on a tissue. And now I will just stipple along the right side to bring out some of the highlights. And while you're doing this, you can also just stipple on some more foliage. And I'm going to start to add more cool yellow into the mixture just to lighten it. Maybe a bit of white. Just gonna clean that off for a second. I got a little bit of it into the water, so I just want to clean that off with a clean brush. Just brush that out. And then you're going to want to paint on some green grass. So I'm going to pick up some cool yellow and some cool blue. And just paint on grassy textures here. And I'll just paint in some color here. And while we're doing that, we can actually use the same color to paint in the foliage in the very foreground here. So using some more cool yellow and some blue, you can use warm blue or a cool blue depending if you want a more vibrant green. And you can just paint on the grassy texture here. You always want to start with the darker base color first and then gradually lighten the color with each layer that you add. So once I have that first layer on, I'm just going to let it dry. So the dark color is always going to dry a little bit lighter than how it looks when it's wet. And then I'm going to add a little bit more yellow into it and highlight with another layer. So that's all we can do for this part here. I'm just going to mix some more yellow in to lighten the green and just go along the top and really highlight that. And with this mixture, I'm just going to mix some more yellow ochre into it and just tap on some more foliage here. I'm just making this up now. As always, we cover this area. And what you can do is also tap on some lighter areas onto the trees you painted before. And then I'm going to keep going here with a little bit of a lighter layer just to highlight the top of some of the grass. And if you're having trouble getting these thinner strokes, just switch to a liner brush. also just going to bring this part down a little bit. It's a little bit too slanted, that starting to look a bit uneven. Then we can go in and work on the water a bit more while also painting in the rocks. So switch back to my liner brush and I'm going to pick up some white. And there's a little bit of blue mixed into it. And I just want to paint on some soft ripples on the water. And I need to reflect a little bit of the land here into the water. We lost some of that as we painted, so I'll mix up a bit of a darker mixture again using cool blue and some black. Go back into my blue mixture here. It can be quite thin, so don't make it too thick and creamy, and just reflect some of that underneath here. And also under here. So you can do this kind of as a glazing layer, so keep the paint more on the thin side as you just glaze over some areas with this darker color. Then just clean it off. If you've done too much, you can just use a clean brush to soften things out a little. So let's paint in the rocks now. I'm just going to pick up some black and I'll just place it here. I'll mix a little bit of white in there just so it's not a pure black. And you can just place in where they are, so I'll just paint in the shape of them first. And remember, the rocks in the distance should be smaller. So in the distance, I'm just going to tap them on and make them really small. And then I'm going to mix a little bit of blue into the mixture and also a bit of white, and I'm just going to highlight the top of the rocks. So I'm just going along to each of them and just placing in this lighter color just on top. Add a little bit more white, just highlight a little bit more. Make sure you do this when the previous layer has dried. And we're also going to want to reflect a little bit of it into the water, otherwise it looks a little bit unrealistic just sitting on the water. So pick up some darker blue paint, so a little bit of cool blue mixed with the black, maybe a bit of burnt umber to dull it down. And just like how we reflected some of the foliage into the water, we're just going to, using very thin down paint, just reflect a little bit into the water underneath the rock so it looks like there's some reflection. Make sure the paint is fairly thin so it's like you're just glazing on underneath. And the last thing I want to do is just paint on some more lighter colors on the grass here. So I'm going to pick up some cool yellow and some cool blue, mix them together. And maybe just add some red in there to tone down the green so it's not so vibrant. And also just give my paint some mist. And using the liner brush, I can get some thinner strokes. I'm just going to play around with the grass a little bit more here. If I want to make this color lighter, I can either add yellow or add white to it. Yellow preserves the greenness of the paint, while white makes it more pastel colored. So that's what you have to think about when deciding whether to add yellow or white to lighten your greens. So I'm going to add a bit of white now into the mixture and just highlight along the very top. Alright, so I'm happy with how it looks now, so I'm gonna say it's finished and I'll just take the tape off for now. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial today. I hope it wasn't too difficult for you to follow along with. If you have any questions at all, just leave them in the comments. And if you want to check out more tutorials, you can find a lot more on my channel, as well as more real-time tutorials like these on my Patreon page. I have a link down below to my website where you can view all of the tutorials I have on Patreon. I have over 40 of them now, and they're all like today's format in real time, where I'm doing a voiceover or speaking as I'm painting. So if you enjoy that slower format, then feel free to have a look at that. Thank you again so much for being here, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.